The dust of the high desert didn't just settle in Sagebrush Crossing. It coated the back of the throat. It was a fine, alkaline powder that tasted of distance and finality. Tamsin O'Rourke tasted it with every dry breath she hauled into her lungs. She walked, leading the mule, a bony, brindle-colored creature named Ishmael, whose hooves made soft, shuffling sounds in the deep, rutted main street. Upon the mule's swayed back sat one scarred leather trunk, bound with brass fittings that had long since turned green. It was not just a trunk. It was the trunk. It held her mother's Bible, her father's ledgers, 2 changes of clothes, and a small tin of coffee. It was the last physical piece of Juniper Bend that hadn't been seized, auctioned, or left to rot by Gideon Thatch. Tamsin had owned, truly owned, by deed and by sweat, 320 acres of high grazing land, tucked into a crease of the mountains where the juniper grew thick and the water ran sweet. Juniper Bend. She had buried her father there just 2 years prior. Now, Thatch owned it. He hadn't used a gun, not for the taking. He had used paper, a notice, nailed splinter deep into her front door, printed in officious black ink, speaking of tax delinquency and public auction. It was a lie sharp as a skinning knife, and it had cut her home out from under her just as cleanly. She'd ridden to the county seat in Mesquite, clutching her own tax receipts, only to be shown a different ledger by a clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. A forgery. A clean, devastating forgery. Sagebrush Crossing watched her come. The town was pretending to be busy, but it was really just coiled tight with fear. Tamsin saw the glances from behind the pulled lace curtains in the assayer's office, the way the blacksmith, Obed Marsh, paused his hammer mid-swing, letting the silence hang heavy. Her arrival was an embarrassment. She was a living reminder of what could happen, of what was happening. The news was already here, carried on the same wind that brought the dust. Gideon Thatch was holding a ball, a civic fundraiser. The new, brightly printed flyers posted on the livery stable called it a celebration for his grand canal project, set for 2 nights from now. Tamsin knew what it was. It wasn't a canal, it was a choke chain. Thatch wasn't bringing water to the territory. He was seizing it, the aquifer they all shared, the one that kept the high desert grazing lands barely alive, would be diverted, owned, and meted out. $1 an acre foot, the rumor went, and only to those who signed his loyalty ledger. Sign, your cattle drink, resist, your land dies of thirst. Juniper Bend had simply been the first parcel he needed to secure the headwaters. Her own thirst was a rasp in her throat. The mule, Ishmael, stumbled, his head dropping low. She had walked him since dawn from the dry camp she'd been forced to make, and the public trough in the center of town was, she noted, chained off. A new padlock glittered on it, Thatch's padlock. She passed the last respectable building, the Copperfinch lodging house, run by the widow Maeve Lark. Tamsin fixed her eyes on it, her next objective. But first, the mule. She continued toward the scrubland where the town frayed into Mesquite and Palo Verde. There was one last structure, set well back from the track, a dugout shack, half timber, half earth, barely higher than a tall man. It looked as if it had been clawed from the dirt rather than built upon it. A single horse, a deep chestnut gelding that looked too fine for the dwelling, stood hip-shot at a battered trough, idly whisking flies. A man was cleaning a saddle on a wooden stand, his back to her. He was not a big man, but he was built of wire and old rope, wearing faded canvas trousers and a flannel shirt worn thin to the threads. He didn't look up, but he stopped moving. The scraping of his knife against the leather ceased. Tamsin's throat was so dry the words barely came. "Mister!" He stayed still for a beat, listening. "I need water," Tamsin said, her voice cracking. "Just for the mule. He's come a long way." The man, Cade Whitlock, turned slowly. He was a man made of edges. His face was geography, mapped by sun and wind, with a stillness in the eyes that was more unsettling than anger. A holstered Remington, cavalry issue by the looks of it, rested easy on his right hip. He looked at her, then at the mule, then back at her. His gaze was flat and assessing. He was counting her resources, Tamsin realized, and finding them wanting. He didn't speak. Instead, in one deliberate, almost formal motion, he unbuckled the gun belt. He laid the entire rig holster, belt, and the heavy pistol on the worn saddle he'd been mending. It was a clear, silent signal, understood by anyone who lived west of the Pecos. I am not a threat to you. Only then did he pick up the dented tin bucket by the rain barrel. He dipped it into the horse's trough, the sound of the water splashing loud in the oppressive silence. He held it out, walking toward the mule. Ishmael surged forward, shoving his dusty muzzle deep into the bucket and drinking noisily. While the mule drank, Tamsin met the man's eyes. They were gray, the color of a winter sky over the dragoons, and they held no pity. She had expected indifference, perhaps suspicion. She saw that, but she also saw something else, something that tightened her chest. It was the look of a coyote that has watched the trap spring on another of its kind. A sharp, clear, unwelcome recognition. He wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing the precise shape of her predicament. He saw a woman clinging to the edge by her fingernails, just as he was. His gaze dropped, just for a second, moving from her face to her left shoulder. The high-necked calico dress was torn at the seam, a fresh rip, and, beneath the tear, the skin was a violent map of purple and yellow. A fresh bruise, ugly and deep, shaped unmistakably like grasping fingers. Cade's voice, when it finally came, was rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "Thatches, man." Tamsin flinched, not at the pain in her shoulder, which was a dull, persistent fire, but at the casual accuracy of his guess. She pulled the torn fabric back over the wound, her gesture stiff with a pride that felt brittle as glass. "Harlan Pike," she said, the name tasting like ash. Pike, Thatch's foreman, the one who had put his hands on her, who had thrown her from her own porch while his men laughed and loaded her wagon with the goods for auction. "I'm not looking for pity, mister," she said, her voice low and fierce, surprising them both. "I'm looking for evidence. Thatch filed a false deed, backed by a bought ledger, and I aim to prove it in court." The reaction was instant and unsettling. When she said the name Harlan Pike, Cade Whitlock went utterly still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't anger she saw in his face, not the hot flush of indignation. It was something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. It was the absolute stillness of a snake coiled in the shade. He stared past her, toward the low, hazy mountains, but his mind was clearly somewhere else, somewhere dark and bloody. Harlan Pike, the name echoed in Cade's skull. He had been a border ranger. Years ago, he had been Cade's partner on a patrol south of the Gila, and he had been a traitor, riding away clean during an ambush, leaving Cade's younger brother to be dragged down and butchered by bandits. A debt, Cade thought, that had festered for 6 long years. A debt that had never been paid. The mule, Ishmael, finished drinking, lifting his head and dripping water onto the dust. The small, tense moment was broken. Tamsin tugged the mule's lead rope. "I'm obliged for the water." She started to walk away, her back straight, every line of her body broadcasting a refusal to be broken, a refusal to be the victim the town already saw her as. "Ma'am?" She stopped but did not turn. Her pride wouldn't let her. She heard his boots on the hard pack, 2 soft crunches. When she finally looked over her shoulder, he was standing there, holding out a small, tightly wrapped roll of clean linen, a bandage. "Keep it clean," he said. It wasn't kindness. It was a practical fact. Infection in the territory was a faster, surer killer than a bullet. She hesitated, then took it, Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His were calloused and hot against her cold skin. "I have nothing to pay you." "It's not a payment," Cade said. He looked down the empty street, his gaze distant again. "It's advice. Thatch keeps his spare horses and his payroll in the canyons off the dry wash. Harlan Pike likes to ride patrol there. Checking the line. Don't go near it alone." It was a warning, but it was also information. It was, she realized, the first useful thing, the first solid piece of ground anyone had offered her in a week. Tamsin nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin. She did not say thank you again. Words were cheap, and they both knew it. She turned and led Ishmael back onto the main track, heading for the lodging house. She was halfway there, the dugout shack behind her, when she heard it, a low, rhythmic vibration in the ground. A sound felt more in the teeth than in the ears, growing stronger. To the east, rising against the sharp, aching blue of the sky, was a plume of dust. It was not the lazy, singular drift of a lone rider or a farm wagon. It was the thick, churning, yellow cloud of a dozen horses, maybe more, moving fast. Thatch's riders. They rode like they owned the ground beneath them, because, Tamsin thought bitterly, they soon would. She stopped, her hand instinctively going to the brass handle of the leather trunk on Ishmael's back. She gripped it hard, the worn leather familiar and solid under her fingers. It was all she had. The riders were still miles off, just a smudge of impending power, but their message was clear. They were the punctuation mark on Thatch's ownership of the valley. Tamsin O'Rourke stood very still in the high desert sun, the roll of linen bandage clutched tight in her other hand, the taste of alkaline dust in her mouth. The fight for Juniper Bend had already cost her peace. It had cost her home. She knew, looking at that inevitable, rising cloud of dust, that the war had just begun, even if not a single shot had yet been fired. The Copper Finch lodging house was the only building in Sagebrush Crossing painted a color that wasn't brown. It was a faded, peeling blue, the color of a robin's egg that had been left in the sun too long. Maeve Lark, its proprietor, matched the building worn but resolute. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a spine of iron and eyes that had seen too much dry weather and too many broken men. Tamsin O'Rourke stood on the porch, her single trunk at her feet, Ishmael tied to the hitching post. "Mrs. Lark," Tamsin began, her voice still rough from the dust. "I need lodging. I have no script." Maeve wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze taking in the fine-spun calico dress, the exhausted mule, and the single trunk. She knew exactly who Tamsin was. The whole town knew. "That's a common complaint in Thatch's territory," Maeve said, her voice neutral. "What do you have?" "I can cook," Tamsin said, lifting her chin. "Biscuits, grits, sourdough. I can break down a side of beef. I can sew a straight seam and I can set a button. I can do laundry until my knuckles bleed. I need a bed, and I need a safe place for my trunk." Maeve Lark was quiet for a long moment, watching the street. Thatch's men were already at the saloon, their laughter a loud, grating noise. "The laundry is lye soap and hard water. Girl, the cooking starts at 4 in the morning. The mending is whatever the drovers tear." "Yes, ma'am." "The attic room," Maeve said, turning. "It's hot in the day and cold at night, and the roof leaks when it rains, but it locks from the inside." She looked at Tamsin's bruised shoulder, still visible through the tear. "And it's paid for, starting now. Get your trunk. Ishmael can stay in my shed. He'll be safe from Pike's men there." The room was small, tucked under the eaves, smelling of dried herbs and old wood. But the lock, as Maeve had promised, was a heavy iron bolt. Tamsin slid her trunk under the narrow cot, her one anchor in a world that had come loose. For the first time in 48 hours, she allowed herself to breathe. That evening, shelling peas in the kitchen, Tamsin listened as Maeve spoke, her voice a low monotone against the clatter of the pans. Maeve told her about the Thatch Canal. It wasn't just a rumor. Thatch was holding meetings, pushing paper. He calls it a community prosperity compact, Maeve said, snapping a bean with unnecessary force. Prosperity for him. He's got men riding to every small ranch, offering a choice. Sign your water rights over to his corporation, and he'll guarantee you water, a fixed price. He says, a price that starts low and bleeds you dry over 5 years. And if they don't sign? Tamsin asked, though she already knew the answer. If you don't sign, Maeve said, dumping the shelled peas into a pot, you get no water from the canal. And when he digs that channel, he's planning to tap the head of the aquifer. The creeks will dry up by August. The wells will be sand by September. It's not a choice. It's a threat. Sign, or your land dies. Tamsin's blood ran cold. Juniper Bend had been first because it held the high ground, the very source Thatch needed to control. She wasn't just fighting for her father's memory. She was the first soldier in a war, whether she liked it or not. Miles away, in the dark, Cade Whitlock was waging his own quiet war. He moved around his dugout in the moonlight, a ghost in his own yard. He was thinking of Harlan Pike, and the memory was a physical weight, a cold stone in his gut. Pike was a man who enjoyed the stalk. He was a creature of the dark, a man who liked to circle his prey, to watch it sweat. Cade took a spool of thin copper wire from his saddlebag. He strung it low, ankle height in a wide perimeter around his shack, looping it through the dense, thorny arms of the mesquite, at 2 points, hidden deep in the brush. He tied small, brass mule bells to the wire, muffling their clappers with a twist of cloth. They wouldn't make a sound unless the wire was tripped hard. But if they did, they would give him 3 seconds of warning. It was all he'd need. He checked the action of his Remington, the click-click of the hammer falling on an empty chamber loud in the night, and then sat in his doorway, facing east, waiting for a dawn that was still hours away. Tamsin began her campaign not with a gun, but with paper. Her days fell into a rhythm. At 4, she was downstairs, her hands in flour, baking the biscuits and johnny cakes for the boarders. Mid-morning, she was at the wash tub, the lye soap stinging her skin. Afternoons were for mending, but in the quiet hours, the 3 hours between the noon meal and the afternoon chores, she worked. She spent the pittance she'd earned mending a drummer's coat on a stagecoach ticket to Mesquite, the county seat, a 20-mile ride over a rough road. The county archive office was a cramped, dusty room behind the courthouse, run by a clerk whose spectacles were thicker than a bottle's bottom. "I need to see the tax ledgers for Juniper Bend," she said, laying her pennies on the counter. "For the past 5 years." The clerk, grudgingly, heaved the massive, leather-bound books onto the table. Tamsin sat for 2 hours, her fingers tracing the columns. It was just as she remembered. Her father's neat, precise hand. Paid in full, October 1880. Paid in full, October 1881. Then, the new ledger. The one from this year. The page for Juniper Bend was different. The entry was cramped. And the signature authorizing the seizure, Ephraim Colt, county assessor. The name was a looping, grandiose scrawl. But Tamsin, who had studied her father's ledgers all her life, noticed the tremor in it, the hand of a drunk, or a man terrified. She pulled the files for other properties. Obed Marsh, the blacksmith, his small pasture, seized 2 months ago. Signed, Ephraim Colt, a widow named Sanchez. Her quarter section by the dry wash, seized 3 weeks ago. Signed, Ephraim Colt. All of them small, all of them vital to the water table. And then she saw it, the county seal. On her father's true deeds, the official seal was impressed cleanly, the ink a faded, respectable black. On the seizure notice, the one signed by Colt, the seal was different. It was slightly misaligned, pressed too hard, and the ink was wrong. It was a bright, vivid blue, a Prussian blue, almost purple, too new and too garish for a county office. She returned the ledgers. "A question," she said to the clerk, her voice casual. "The county's supplies, ink, paper. Where do you purchase them?" The clerk didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Dry Star Freight, Thatch's company, has the county contract. He gives us a good rate, saves the taxpayers money." Tamsin felt a cold, sharp click in her mind. Gideon Thatch owned the freight company that delivered the ink for the county seal that was being used to forge the documents that gave him the land. It was a snake eating its own tail, and she was standing right in the middle of the circle. Cade, meanwhile, sought his information from a different source. He rode into Sagebrush Crossing and went straight to the squat clapboard building that served as the sheriff's office. The woman inside was not the sheriff. She was polishing the brass on a rifle stock, her sleeves rolled up. Deputy Nora Bell was a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same hard granite as the mountains. She wore her gun belt high and tight, and her eyes missed nothing. Cade stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. "I'm looking for information on Gideon Thatch." Nora Bell didn't stop polishing. "That's a quick way to get yourself buried. Mr. Sheriff's out of town, on Thatch's business, I imagine." "I'm not asking the sheriff, I'm asking you." She finally looked up, her gaze as assessing as his had been with Tamsin. "I know who you are. You're the man in the dugout, Whitlock. You want to go after Thatch, you'd better have more than a pistol and a grudge. Thatch owns the sheriff. He owns the judge in Mesquite. You bring a case to that court, Thatch will use your own paperwork to hang you with." "What about a man named Ephraim Colt?" Cade asked, his voice low. Nora allowed herself a small, bitter smile. Colt's just a puddle of whiskey with a pen. He's got a gambling streak a mile wide and a spine made of jelly. Thatch doesn't own him. He just rents him. One bottle of rye at a time. He's at the Starboard Saloon every night, losing money he doesn't have. "What would it take?" Cade pressed. "To make a charge stick?" Nora stood, her presence suddenly filling the small office. "It's not enough to be right. Whitlock, in this territory, right is just a word. You need proof. Hard proof. The kind of thing that can't be burned or buried. And more than that," she said, motioning to the window. "You need them." Cade looked. She was pointing at the town, at Obed Marsh and his smithy, at the shopkeepers sweeping their porches, at the ranchers loading their wagons. "Right now," Nora said. "This town is terrified. Thatch has them by the throat, and they're afraid to even clear their lungs. You want justice, you bring me a mountain of evidence, and you bring me the people, standing right behind you. Until then, stay out of my way. I've got enough trouble." That night, Tamsin was late returning to the Copperfinch. Maeve had sent her to the Mercantile for a sack of cornmeal. The street was dark, the moon hidden by a high, thin layer of clouds. She clutched the sack, walking fast, her boots echoing in the empty street. She heard them before she saw them. 2 sets of footsteps, heavy, confident. They came out of the alley between the bathhouse and the land office, blocking her path. "Well, look here," one of them said. He was big, smelling of stale beer and horses. "It's the little queen of Juniper Bend, or what's left of it." "Heard you was asking questions, ma'am," the other one said, his voice a wheedle. "Asking questions all the way over in Mesquite." Tamsin's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground. "I'm a free citizen. I can ask what I please." The big one laughed. "Mister, Thatch don't like folks poking their noses in county business, especially not women. Maybe we ought to teach you some manners before the big dance." He reached out, his hand grasping her arm. Before she could even drop the sack, a voice came from the shadows behind her. It was flat, cold, and carried no echo. "Let her go." Cade Whitlock stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. He didn't need it. His presence was a weapon in itself. The 2 thugs turned, squinting. "And who the hell are you? This ain't your affair, old man." Cade took one slow step forward, into the faint light from the saloon. Tell Harlan Pike that Cade Whitlock is in town. Tell him I'm looking for him. Tell him I'm here to settle a debt. He'll remember me." The men's posture changed. The names meant nothing to them separately, perhaps, but the combination, the name Pike spoken with the authority of this stranger, made them uncertain. The thug holding Tamsin's arm released it, as if her skin had suddenly turned hot. "We'll pass it on," the man mumbled, suddenly losing all his swagger. They backed away, disappearing into the same alley they had come from. Tamsin was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, sharp rage. She bent to retrieve the sack of cornmeal. Cade didn't move to help her. He just watched. They stood in the dark, the silence heavy. Without a word, Tamsin turned and continued her walk. Cade fell into step beside her, a few feet away. They walked in silence to the edge of town, stopping by the chained-off public trough. The metal links gleamed dully in the starlight. "You were following me," Tamsin said. It was not a question. "I was watching," Cade replied. "Pike's men, they're clumsy, but they're mean." They stood apart, the width of a nervous horse between them. Two solitary figures in a town that didn't want them. "They work for Thatch," Tamsin said, stating the obvious, needing to fill the silence. "They answer to Pike," Cade said. "His signature is on their pay. It seems, ma'am, we have the same enemy, just for different reasons." Tamsin looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, softened just barely by the night. "I don't trust shadows, Mr. Whitlock." "And I don't trust paper, Miss O'Rourke," he countered. "But it seems we're what's available." The admission hung in the cold desert air. It was not an alliance. It was a mutual acknowledgement of a shared trap. "Ephraim Colt," Tamsin said, offering her first piece, testing the strength of this fragile connection. "He signed the seizure papers. He's the county assessor." "Nora Bell says he's a drunk and a gambler." Cade offered his piece in return. "Spends every night at the Starboard Saloon, losing script he doesn't have." "The ink," Tamsin said, the final piece falling into place. "The county seal on the forged deed. It's a Prussian blue, a specific make. It came from Thatch's freight depot. Dry Star Freight. I'm sure of it." Cade nodded, his mind working. The drunkard, the ink, the freight house. The plan formed in the darkness, unspoken but clear. "I'll watch Colt," Cade said. "A drunk man talks. A gambling man is always for sale. I'll find out what Thatch used to buy his signature." Tamsin looked down the street, at the large, dark silhouette of the Dry Star Freight warehouse. It was locked up, a private fortress in the middle of town. "And I," she said, her voice finding a new hardness, "will find the ink. That place is locked up tighter than a drum." Cade warned, "Then I'll find a way in." The night smelled of dust and distance. A cold wind, sharp with the grit of the high lonely, tore through Sagebrush Crossing, rattling the loose tin roofs and slamming a shutter somewhere in the dark. It was the perfect cover. Tamsin O'Rourke did not look like herself. She wore a pair of her father's old canvas trousers, held up with a length of rope, and a dark flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair was ruthlessly tucked under a floppy canvas cap. She moved in the deep shadow of the adobe wall, carrying nothing but a short, heavy pry bar she'd taken from Maeve's shed. The Dry Star Freight warehouse was a long, low fortress of timber and tin, set back from the main street. A single lantern burned in the front office, but the main loading bay was dark. She'd watched it for 2 nights. The single night watchman, a man named Peters, did a circuit at 11, then settled in the front office with a bottle until dawn. She didn't go near the front. She went around back to the high window that faced the alley. It was, as Cade had noted, locked, but it was a simple slide bolt, and the wood of the frame was old and soft. Tamsin jammed the pry bar into the seam. She put her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth, expecting a crack. Instead, The dry wood gave way with a soft, splintering groan, swallowed instantly by a gust of wind. She was inside in a second, landing light on a stack of burlap sacks. The air in the warehouse was thick and still, a layered scent of raw coffee beans, machine oil, cured leather, and the sharp, chemical smell of new-milled pine. Moonlight filtered through the high, filthy windows. Cut pale, ghostly lanes across the towering stacks of crates and barrels. She bypassed the main floor and headed for the small, elevated office built into the back corner. She ascended the 3 rickety steps and tested the door. Unlocked. Thatch's arrogance was his weakness. Inside, she struck one of Maeve's sulfur matches, the flare-up blinding her for a second. A small oil lamp sat on the desk. She lit it, turning the wick down until it was just a small, smoky bead of light, barely enough to see. The office was chaos invoices, bills of lading, and wanted posters were impaled on a spike on the wall. A tall ledger rack stood against the far wall. She ran her fingers along the spines. Inventory, payroll, consignments. She pulled the consignments book. It was heavy, bound in cheap black leather. She laid it flat on the desk, the small lamp illuminating the page. Her fingers, still raw from the lye soap, traced the neat columns. She found it on the 3rd page, under a shipment of barbed wire and seed. Recipient County Clerk, Mesquite. Her breath caught. 1 crate, office supplies, and listed below. Itemized ink, special order, Prussian Blue No, 366 vials. It was real. The words on the page were a physical thing, a rock in her hand. She had him. She had the supply line. She was about to close the book when her gaze fell on a small, wooden box tucked onto a low shelf under the desk, half hidden by a rolled-up Navajo blanket. It was out of place. It wasn't for shipping. It was for hiding. She pulled it out. It was a simple pine box, dovetailed at the corners. Not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a heavy brass seal. It was new, the metal bright. She picked it up. It was the Great Seal of Mesquite County. She held it close to the tiny flame. And then she saw it. The engraver's error, a mistake born of arrogance and haste. Around the rim, the letters were clear: COUNTYOFMESQUITTE. 2 T's. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. This was the source. This was the tool that was stealing her land. Stealing all their land, a forged, misspelled seal. A heavy thud from the front of the warehouse made her heart stop. The main cargo door sliding open. Tamsin killed the lamp wick with a pinch of her fingers, plunging the office into absolute blackness. She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears, louder than the wind. "Get the door shut, you damn fools!" It was Harlan Pike's voice, not drunk, but sharp and angry. "This wind'll tear it from the runners." Heavy boots stamped on the wooden floor. Not 1 man, 3, maybe 4. They were back. They weren't supposed to be back. "Boss, Peters is asleep in the office," another voice said. "Drag him out." Pike snapped. "And light a lamp. I need to check the inventory on that Springfield shipment before morning." Tamsin's blood turned to ice. They were coming to the office. She couldn't go down the steps. They'd see her. She looked around the small space, frantic. There was no other exit. She was trapped. She backed against the wall, her hand landing on the railing. She looked down. Below the raised office was a row of large, open-topped barrels. Oats, cornmeal, flour. She didn't hesitate. Clutching the heavy brass seal, she swung 1 leg over the railing and dropped, landing with a soft thud in the nearest barrel. She sank deep, the dry oats rushing up around her. She pulled the lid, which was leaning against the wall, half over the top, and burrowed down, pulling the grain over her head until she was completely submerged. It was suffocating. The air was thick, hot, and full of a fine, choking dust that filled her mouth and nose. She forced herself to breathe shallowly through the fabric of her shirt, tasting the raw, dry grain. She clutched the brass seal to her chest. She heard the heavy tread of Pike's boots as he climbed the steps to the office, right above her head. She heard the scrape of a match. Useless. Pike muttered. He was rummaging through the desk. He's got the paperwork all to hell. Boss, the other man called from the floor. Them Springfields are over by the south wall. Fine, I'll be down in a minute. Tamsin held her breath, her lungs burning. The dust was torture. She was going to cough. She was going to sneeze, and they would find her, and it would all be over. Pike's boots descended the stairs. He stopped. He was standing not 5 feet from her barrel. She could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath, even through the oats. You find that old man? Pike asked. The one they said was asking after me. Name of Whitlock, the man replied. Just a drifter. He's holed up in the dugout by the wash. Ain't done nothing. He's done something, Pike said, his voice a low growl. He's still breathing. I'll handle him after the ball. Thatch wants this clean. The other man chuckled. Speaking of the ball, boss, what about that high and mighty O'Rourke woman heard she's slinging hash for Maeve Lark? Tamsin's entire body went rigid. She heard the smile in Harlan Pike's voice. It was a greasy, confident sound. Oh, her... Don't you worry about Miss Tamsin O'Rourke. Thatch wants this whole town to see what happens when you sign, and what happens when you don't. He'll make his speech, and then, just to show there's no hard feelings, his voice dropped, thick with amusement. I'm going to invite her for a dance, right in the middle of the floor, in front of God and everyone. We'll see how proud she is then. The men laughed. Rage, pure and clean, burned through Tamsin's fear. She was no longer suffocating. She was surviving. She would live to see this man's face when she brought him down. The men moved off, their lanterns receding toward the far side of the warehouse. Tamsin stayed buried, counting. She counted to 500, forcing her breathing to slow. The air was unbreathable. She was getting dizzy. Then, a new sound. A frantic, high-pitched shout from outside. Fire, fire at the carriage shed, the wagons are burning. Pike's voice roared, echoing through the warehouse. Damn it all, my new saddle's in there, both of you. Get out, get the horses loose, get the pump. Heavy boots pounded the floor, running for the front door. The sound of the door scraping open and the howl of the wind rushing in. Cade. It had to be. The white cloth she had tied to the broken window bar. Their signal. Tamsin burst from the barrel, gasping, spilling a shower of oats onto the floor. She was choking, spitting dust, her eyes streaming. She scrambled to the office, grabbed the heavy consignments ledger from the desk, and ran. She didn't go for the front. She ran back to the window she'd broken. She tossed the ledger out into the alley, then clambered up the sacks, stuffing the heavy brass seal into her trouser pocket. She tumbled through the window frame, catching her shirt on a splinter, and landed hard on the sandy ground outside. She grabbed the ledger and sprinted for the dark mouth of the alley. A shape stepped out of the shadows, solid and immovable. She cried out, colliding hard with a solid chest. Strong hands gripped her elbows. Steadying her, it was Cade. His face was a mask of shadows in the wild, flickering orange light from the burning shed across the street. He didn't ask a single question. He just saw her, saw the book, and knew. Go, he whispered, his voice a low command. A shrill whistle cut through the chaos. There at the window. Tamsin looked back. Harlan Pike was standing in the alley, not 20 yards away, a pistol in his hand. He had seen the spilled oats, the broken window. Stop right there, he yelled. A blossom of orange fire erupted from his hand. The crack of the shot was deafening, and the bullet whined past Tamsin's head, so close she felt its hot wind. It shattered a clay pot on the wall behind her. Cade didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, shoving her toward the end of the alley. The dry wash now. They ran, their boots slipping on the loose gravel. Behind them, More shouts. They reached the end of the alley, the dark, open ground of the town's edge. The land fell away sharply. A 10-foot drop to the sandy bottom of the dry creek bed. They didn't stop. They launched themselves into the darkness, sliding, stumbling, rolling down the steep embankment in a miniature avalanche of sand and loose rock. They landed in a heap at the bottom, the sand soft and cold. Tamsin was panting, her lungs burning, her hands scraped raw from the fall. She had held on to the ledger. Above them, on the lip of the embankment, Boots skidded to a stop. "Where'd they go?" "Hell if I know, get a lantern, they can't have gone far." But they were hidden. The high, undercut bank and the pitch-black darkness of the wash was their sanctuary. Tamsin lay on her back, gasping for air, the heavy ledger on her chest, the misspelled seal a hard lump in her pocket. She was covered in oat dust, sand, and sweat. Her whole body was one trembling, exhausted ache. Cade was already on his feet, a shadow among shadows. Listening, his head tilted. He wasn't even breathing hard. A sound started in Tamsin's chest. It was a dry, breathless, half-choked sound. It was a laugh. It wasn't funny. It was the sound of a spring, coiled to the breaking point. Finally unspooling. She had been trapped. She had been humiliated. She had been shot at. And she was still here. She sat up, the laugh turning into a dry cough as the oat dust hit her throat. "It's been a long time," she choked out, wiping her streaming eyes, leaving a muddy streak across her face. "It's been a long time since I survived by laughing." Cade looked down at her, a wild, filthy, triumphant mess in the faint moonlight. The hard, frozen stillness in his own eyes seemed to thaw, just a fraction. He looked back up the embankment, where the lights of the pursuers were now bobbing in the distance. "Ma'am," Cade said, and his voice was rough, but it was the closest to gentle she had ever heard it. "It's been a long time since I laughed because I wanted to survive." The fire at the carriage shed was the talk of Sagebrush Crossing. It was declared an accident, a stray spark from the forge, but everyone knew it was more. It was a crack in the smooth, oppressive surface of Gideon Thatch's control, and the name whispered in the mercantile, in the laundry, and over the saloon tables was not Cade Whitlock. It was Tamsin O'Rourke. She had become, overnight, something different. She was no longer just a victim to be pitied, a cautionary tale of Thatch's power. She was a threat. When Tamsin walked into the mercantile that morning for flour, the low hum of conversation stopped. Men looked down at their boots. Mrs. Hatcher, who was measuring out ribbon, suddenly found her scissors intensely interesting. Tamsin felt the weight of their fear. If she could be targeted, so could they. She paid for her flour. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a nervous man with a thin mustache, counted her coins. His hands were shaking. As he passed her the heavy burlap sack, his fingers pressed a folded piece of paper into her palm. He didn't look at her. He just cleared his throat and turned to the next customer. Back in the kitchen of the Copper Finch, Tamsin unfolded it. It was a copy of Thatch's Community Prosperity Compact. She read the dense legal text, her blood growing colder with every line. It was exactly as Maeve had described, a complete and irreversible transfer of all water rights, riparian or otherwise, to Thatch's new corporation. In exchange, the signer was guaranteed water at a price to be set by the corporation, adjustable per annum. It was a sharecropper's contract for water. It was slavery. She knew she couldn't wait. She took the consignment's ledger and the heavy, misspelled brass seal, wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth, and went to see Nora Bell. The deputy's office was quiet. The sheriff, as Nora had predicted, was out of town, which meant he was at Thatch's ranch, taking his orders. Tamsin placed the ledger and the seal on the desk. Nora Bell did not touch them, not at first. She just looked at them. Then she picked up the seal, her thumb tracing the heavy brass, feeling the double T in mesquite. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "Well," she said, her voice dry, "that's arrogance, and arrogance gets sloppy." She opened the ledger, her finger following the line item for Prussian blue ink. "This is good. This links his freight company to the county office. This," she held up the seal, "is the hammer. It proves intent to defraud. It's a way in. O'Rourke, a real way." Tamsin felt a surge of triumph, sharp and hot. "Then you can arrest him." Nora's smile vanished. She sat back, her chair creaking. "Arrest who, Thatch, based on what a book you stole and a seal you found in a warehouse you broke into. I take this to Judge Harlan, and yes, he's Pike's cousin, and Thatch will walk out in 5 minutes. He'll say you forged the book. He'll say you cast that seal yourself to frame him. He'll have 4 men, including the sheriff, swear they saw you do it." "But it's the truth," Tamsin protested, the words sounding hollow even to her. "Truth don't mean a thing in that courtroom," Nora said, tapping the desk. "Right now, this is your word against Gideon Thatch's, and his word owns this county. This," she pointed to the evidence, "is just paper and metal. It's not enough. I need a voice. I need a witness, a living, breathing person, someone respectable, who will stand up in court and say, 'Gideon Thatch forced me. You bring me a person, Tamsin, and I can use this. Until then, hide it.'" Tamsin left the office, the weight of the ledger in her bag heavier than before. A witness, someone respectable. Her steps led her, without conscious thought, to the small adobe church on the edge of town. Its white paint was peeling, and the small garden beside it was a patch of withered, brown stalks. She found Father Merrick not at the altar, but in the garden, staring at his dead tomato plants. He was a small, pale man, his cassock stained with the dust. "Father," Tamsin said gently. He jumped, startled, his hands fluttering to his chest. "Ah, Miss O'Rourke, a sad sight, isn't it? The ground is so hard, we have no water for them." "But, Mr. Thatch has promised you water." Tamsin said, "It was not a question." Father Merrick's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. He could not meet her eyes. He has proposed a project for the good of the community. Yes, the church must support prosperity." "He calls it prosperity," Tamsin said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I call it theft. He offered you water for the church, for the small orphanage you run, and in exchange, you gave him your support. You signed his compact." It was a practical decision." The priest stammered, twisting his hands. "The children need to drink. The school needs water. He assured me it was a formality." "This is his formality," Tamsin said. She reached into her bag and brought out the misspelled brass seal. She held it out. Father Merrick stared at it, his eyes widening in confusion. "The county seal." "Look closely," Tamsin urged, "at the spelling." He bent closer, his finger tracing the letters. "Mesquite, with 2 T's, but that's wrong." "He's using this, Father, a forged seal. He's using it to create forged deeds and seize land. He used it to steal my home, and he is using your good name, your signature on his compact, as a shield to hide behind. You are not supporting a community. You are helping a thief." The priest stumbled back, his hand over his mouth. The full weight of his compromise seemed to crash down on him. Oh, God, forgive me. I knew it felt wrong. I knew, but I told myself it was for the greater good." His eyes filled with tears, not of self-pity, but of genuine, scalding shame. "I have stood at that pulpit and preached about bearing false witness, while my own name was on a lie." He looked at Tamsin, his gaze finally steady. "My conscience is a poor, withered thing, Miss O'Rourke, but it is not dead. Thatch thinks he bought my silence. He will find he only rented it. When the time comes, when you need me, I will speak. I will testify to what I know. I will tell the truth. While Tamsin secured the conscience of the church, Cade Whitlock went hunting for the conscience of the county. The Starboard Saloon was dim even in the bright afternoon. The air blew with smoke. Cade was not a drinking man, but he knew the habits of those who were. He sat in a dark corner, a mug of stale beer untouched in front of him, and he watched. Ephraim Colt was just as Norabel had described. He was a man eroding, his fine wool suit stained and rumpled, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his cards. He was playing poker at a back table with two of Thatch's men, and he was losing. Cade watched for an hour. He watched Colt lose his cash. He watched him sign an IOU. He watched him lose that, too. Finally, the game broke up. Thatch's men laughed, pocketing the script. Colt, his face slick with sweat, tried to order another drink. The bartender shook his head. "Your credit's no good. Ephraim, Mr. Thatch's orders." Colt staggered out into the alley. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Cade gave him 30 seconds, then followed. He found Colt leaning against the brick wall, weeping into his hands, a man hollowed out by his own appetites. Cade stepped out of the shadows. "A hard run, Mr. Colt." Colt looked up, his eyes bleary and unfocused. "Who are you? Go away. Leave me be." Cade took a small, silver flask from his coat pocket. "I'm just a man who appreciates a good signature." He unstopped the flask. The smell of quality whiskey cut through the stink of the alley. "It's hard work, signing papers for Gideon Thatch." Colt's eyes fixed on the flask. He licked his lips. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean," Cade said, his voice a low, patient rumble, "a man as important as the county assessor must get a powerful thirst, especially when he has to backdate a seizure notice, especially when he has to sign his name to a lie that takes a woman's home." Colt lunged for the flask, but Cade held it just out of reach. "Who are you?" Colt whispered, terrified. "I'm the man who was in the Dry Star warehouse last night," Cade said, lying with absolute calm. "I saw the private ledgers, Ephraim, the ones that don't go to the county, the consulting fees paid to you, the gambling markers Thatch bought from this saloon, the crates of whiskey delivered to your home, all marked machine parts. Thatch owns you, body and soul." The assessor collapsed, sliding down the wall. The truth, spoken so plainly, broke him. "He made me." Colt sobbed, the words pouring out of him in a desperate, wretched stream. "He had my debts. He said he'd ruin me, have me thrown in jail for embezzlement. He said it was just tidying up the books. Unclaimed land. He called it Deadwood. He said no one would care. He just put the papers on my desk and said, 'Sign.' And I signed. I signed them all." Cade tossed him the flask. Colt seized it and drank greedily. Cade had his witness. He turned and walked away, leaving the man to his whiskey and his shame. The next morning, the banners went up. They were huge, canvas signs, painted in bright blue and white, strung across the main street. Gideon Thatch presents the future of prosperity. And at the Granary Hall, the biggest sign of all community ball and canal celebration. Tonight, all are welcome. Admission free. Maeve Lark stood on the porch of the Copper Finch, her arms crossed, watching Thatch's men hang the last one. "Free," she said, the word a curse. "He wants the whole town there. He's not celebrating. Tamsin. He's demanding fealty." She turned to Tamsin, who was standing in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. "He's setting a trap, girl. You know what Harlan Pike said. He'll get on that stage, and he'll make his grand speech, and he'll point to you in the crowd. He'll paint you as a sore loser, a liar. He'll humiliate you. He'll ask you to dance. And when you say no, he'll make you the villain. Don't go. Don't walk into his snare." Tamsin looked at the banner, the paint still gleaming wet in the sun. She thought of the misspelled seal, of Father Merrick's shame, of Ephraim Colt sobbing in an alley. "He is setting a trap. Maeve," Tamsin said, her voice shaking but hard. But he's expecting a rabbit. He's not expecting a wolf. She folded her apron and laid it on the railing. Nora Bell said I need the people behind me. Well, Thatch is gathering them for me. He's building his own stage, hanging his own lights. I can't let him tell his story. I have to be there. I have to tell the truth, in front of everyone, before he locks them all into his lie. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, Tamsin stood on the porch, waiting. The wind was picking up, carrying the cold, clean scent of sagebrush from the high desert. It was the smell of Juniper Bend. He appeared as he always did, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper twilight. Cade Whitlock stopped at the bottom of the steps. I found Colt, he said. He's broken. He'll testify. And I found Father Merrick. Tamsin replied, his conscience will make him speak. We have them. Cade, we have the witnesses. Nora will have to act now, Cade said. She will, Tamsin said. But Thatch is acting tonight. He's planning to announce the canal is funded and the compacts are unbreakable. I'm going to that ball. I'm taking the ledger and the seal. Cade looked at the granary hall, now blazing with lanterns. The sound of a fiddle tuning up already drifting on the wind. Pike will be there. I know, she said, her voice flat. He plans to ask me for a dance. The muscle in Cade's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that invitation meant. It was an act of ultimate possession, a public branding. He walked up the steps to stand on the porch with her, but he kept his distance. Then I'm going. It's not your fight, Cade. Not this part of it. This is paper and words. Pike is my fight, he said, his voice low and absolute. You brought him back into my world, Tamsin, and you are not walking into that hall full of his men alone. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear in the dusk. I'll be right behind you, whether the fiddler plays or the lights go out, whether he offers you a hand or he draws a gun. I will be there. Tamsin met his gaze. She gave a single, sharp nod. They stood in silence on the porch, not touching. The gap between them was a physical thing, a few feet of empty air, but the wind, smelling of sage, eddied around them. And the silence was no longer cold or empty. It was charged with a shared purpose, a taut, unspoken promise that was as warm and solid as a lit stove in a cold room. The granary hall was unrecognizable, usually a vast, barn-like space smelling of dried oats and axle grease. It had been transformed. Hundreds of paper lanterns, brought all the way from Tucson, hung from the rafters, casting a warm, generous yellow glow. The floor had been swept and waxed. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted beef, sourdough bread, and barrels of beer and punch. A trio of fiddlers sawed away at a reel, their music bright and desperate against the backdrop of the cold night. At the center of it all stood Gideon Thatch. He was not the rough-hewn cattle baron. Tonight, he was the statesman. He wore a black broadcloth tailcoat, a silk vest, and a gleaming white shirt. A heavy gold watch chain was looped across his middle. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands with ranchers, bowing to their wives. His smile as yellow and expensive as the gold on his chain. He was the picture of power, a man distributing his own benevolence, and the town, hungry for any scrap of hope, was drinking it in. The music stuttered, the fiddler's bow scratching on a high note, and then stopped. The heavy double doors at the entrance had swung open. Tamsin O'Rourke stood silhouetted in the doorway. Behind her, a shadow that resolved itself into the shape of a man, was Cade Whitlock. The hall went utterly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling around the doorframe and the soft pop of a lantern wick. Tamsin was not dressed for a ball. She wore a simple, high-necked dress of dark blue calico, a dress that had been mended at the cuff. It was the best thing she had, and it was still the uniform of a woman who worked for a living. Her hair was not styled, but pulled back in a severe, tight knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, but they did not flinch from the sudden, intense scrutiny of 100 pairs of eyes. In her right hand, She clutched a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Cade stepped just inside the door. To her left, he wore his trail duster, unbuttoned, and his battered hat. He ignored the stunned, hostile stares of the townsfolk. His gaze was cold and professional, scanning the room, marking the exits, and settling for a fraction of a second on Harlan Pike, who stood near the punch bowl with 3 of his men, a look of amused contempt on his face. Gideon Thatch was the first to recover. His broad, beneficent smile returned. This, his expression said, was even better than he had planned. A public reconciliation would be the final stone in his crown. He moved toward her, his steps unhurried, his arms open wide as if to embrace a lost child. The crowd parted for him. "Miss O'Rourke," he boomed, his voice full of false warmth and magnanimity. "Tamsin, I am so deeply glad you decided to join our celebration. It shows a wisdom and a community spirit that does you credit." He stopped 5 feet from her, close enough for the whole room to hear. "There have been," he continued, lowering his voice to a tone of sympathetic understanding, "unfortunate disagreements, misunderstandings, fueled by grief and hardship." He held out one white-gloved hand, palm up. "But tonight is a night for the future. For our future, I ask you, as a gesture of goodwill, to show this town that we are united. Let us put the past behind us. Will you grant me this dance?" It was a masterstroke of theater. If she accepted, she was conquered. Her fight was over, reduced to a misunderstanding. If she refused, she was churlish, petty, a sore loser who was standing in the way of prosperity. The entire hall held its collective breath. Tamsin looked at the offered glove. It was pristine, white, and obscene. She looked up from the hand to the smiling, confident face of the man who had stolen her home, the man who had ordered her terrorized, the man who was strangling the life from the valley. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. In the dead, waiting silence, her words cut like a shard of glass. "I'd rather die." A woman in the front row let out a sharp, shocked gasp and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Obed Marsh, the blacksmith, standing by the wall, looked down and suddenly found a crack in the floorboards fascinating. Thatch's smile did not falter, but it became a fixed, brittle thing, the warmth vanishing, leaving only the shape of it. The silence was broken by a loud, ugly burst of laughter. Harlan Pike shoved himself away from the wall, his spurs ringing on the wood. "Well, what did you expect, boss?" he called out, his voice filling the hall. "She's an ungrateful one, ain't she? You offer her civilization, and she shows you she's got no manners." He started to walk toward Tamsin, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, a sneer twisting his mouth. Maybe she needs a stronger invitation. He had taken 2 steps when Cade Whitlock moved. Cade did not reach for his gun. He did not speak. He simply walked forward, past Tamsin, to the small, empty table by the door that held a stack of punch cups. With a slow, deliberate motion, he removed his hat. He turned it over and placed it, crown down, on the wooden table. It was not a loud noise, just the soft whump of felt on pine. But the meaning was absolute. It was the gesture of a man who was not leaving. It was the gesture of a man settling a dispute in a saloon, a man clearing his hands for a fight. Harlan Pike stopped dead. His sneer faltered. He knew that gesture. Every man in the room knew it. The challenge had been answered. In that new, heavier silence, Tamsin moved. She ignored Pike, ignored Cade. She walked straight past Gideon Thatch, who stood frozen, his white hand still hovering in the air. She walked directly to the small, raised platform where the fiddlers sat, their instruments now silent. She stepped up the 3 steps, standing above the crowd, the lanterns illuminating her face. "He talks about unity," Tamsin said, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, vibrating with a controlled, cold fury. "He talks about the future. She held up the oilcloth-wrapped packet. "I am here to talk about the truth." "Now, Miss O'Rourke," Thatch began, his voice losing its boom. "This is hardly the time or the place for—" "This is the only time and place," Tamsin shot back, cutting him off. The crowd murmured. She had seized the stage from him. She unwrapped the packet, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice solidifying. "He took my home, Juniper Bend, claiming I had not paid my taxes. He used a forged deed to do it." "Lies," Thatch roared, his face purpling. "Slander." "It is not slander," Tamsin said. "When you have the proof." She held up the heavy, gleaming object from the packet, the brass seal. "He used this," she announced. "The Great Seal of Mesquite County, or a very good copy, but his forger made a mistake." She held it high for all to see. "He misspelled the name of our county. He spelled Mesquite with 2 T's. A wave of whispers swept the room. "Mesquite." People repeated the word. It was a tangible, ridiculous, damning detail. "And where did he get such a tool?" Tamsin continued, her voice rising, pressing her advantage. She held up the heavy black ledger. "He had it shipped, along with a special order of Prussian blue ink, to his own company, the Dry Star Freight Warehouse. It is all right here, in his own consignment ledger." She pointed to the back of the room, her finger finding the pale, sweating face of Ephraim Colt, who was trying to hide behind a stack of barrels. "He bought the silence of your county assessor. He paid Ephraim Colt's gambling debts and fed him whiskey in exchange for his signature on those illegal seizures. He calls it water fees in his private books." "That's enough," a new voice commanded. The crowd turned. Deputy Nora Bell stepped into the center of the room. She was in full uniform, her badge polished, her hand resting on her holstered pistol. She had been standing by the door, waiting. She walked not to Thatch, but to Tamsin. She looked up at her on the stage, her face grim. "Miss O'Rourke, you are making serious allegations." "They are the truth, Deputy," Tamsin said, meeting her gaze. "Then I will take that book and that seal," Nora said, holding out a hand, "as evidence in an official investigation into the business practices of Gideon Thatch and the Dry Star Freight Company." She took the ledger and the seal from Tamsin's hands. It was done. The truth was out, and it was now in the hands of the law. Thatch looked from Nora to Tamsin, his face a mask of disbelief, his grand performance shattered. He saw the faces of the townsfolk, no longer adoring, but suspicious, angry. Harlan Pike saw it, too. He saw the paper victory, and he answered it with the only language he knew. He did not yell. He did not warn. He pulled his revolver and fired 2 shots, not at Nora, not at Tamsin, but straight up. The crack of the .45 was deafening. The bullets ripped through the paper lanterns and shattered the main pulley for the central chandelier. With a groan of metal and wood, the heavy iron wheel crashed down. The hall was plunged into instant, suffocating darkness. The panic was absolute. It was a single animal sound. People screamed, shoving, falling over tables and each other. A terrified mass fighting for the one door. Tamsin stood frozen on the stage, blind. She had the seal and ledger 1 second, and the next, only darkness. Before she could even process the blackness, a solid body slammed into her. It was Cade. He didn't grab her. He encircled her, a wall of muscle and leather. His left arm wrapped around her waist, his right hand clamped over the back of her head, forcing it down. "Down, move," he roared in her ear. He didn't lead her. He propelled her, shoving her off the low stage. They fell together, tumbling behind a tall stack of grain barrels that were pushed against the wall. He twisted in the air, ensuring he landed first, his body taking the full impact on the hard floor. He landed on his back and side, pulling her on top of him, shielding her completely. His duster flared out, creating a small, dark tent over her. She was pressed against his chest, her face buried in his shoulder. She could feel the hard, steady, rapid thump, thump, thump of his heart against her cheek. The world was reduced to the smell of him gunpowder, trail dust, and a faint, clean scent of sage and the terrifying, echoing chaos of the pandemonium outside their small haven. "Stay down," he breathed, his voice a low rumble against her ear. The screaming subsided as people spilled out into the night. Shouts of, "Get the lamps, light the sconces," echoed in the ruined hall. A match scraped, then another. The wall lamps were lit, one by one, casting a sickly, flickering light. Cade pushed her gently, rolling her off him as he got to his knees, pulling her up with him. The hall was a disaster. Overturned tables, spilled food, and whimpering townsfolk. Gideon Thatch was gone. Harlan Pike and his men were gone. Nora Bell was on one knee, 10 feet away. She was holding her head. "They hit me," she groaned. "In the dark." She looked at her empty hands, then at the floor around her. "The evidence," Tamsin whispered, her stomach turning to cold lead. The ledger was gone. The misspelled brass seal was gone. They had been stolen in the instant of manufactured chaos. Nora Bell got to her feet, her face grim, a thin trickle of blood running from her temple. She looked at Tamsin, then at Cade. The theater was over. "Well," Nora said, brushing the dust from her uniform, "the play is finished." Tamsin looked at the empty doorway, the cold night wind blowing trash into the ruined hall. She had won. For 30 seconds. Now. Thatch had the evidence, and he had the law, and he had the night. Cade had been right. Paper and words had failed. Tamsin looked at Nora, then at Cade, the only two people in the entire territory she could trust. The fight for paper was over. The fight for blood had just begun. They didn't run through the town. That would have been suicide. Cade grabbed Tamsin's hand, his grip hard and non-negotiable, and pulled her back through the now empty granary hall. He shoved open the rear service door, and they spilled out into the alley just as the first cold drops of rain began to fall. "Where are we going?" Tamsin gasped, stumbling to keep up. "Not Maeve's. It's the first place Pike will look. My place. It's high ground, and it's defensible." His horse was tethered in the shadows 2 streets over, where he'd left it. It was a fast, silent ride. Tamsin riding behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against the cold, damp leather of his duster. She clutched the torn fabric of her dress, her mind replaying the image of Nora Bell's empty hands, the look of triumph on Pike's face in the dark. The evidence was gone, all of it, the ledger, the seal, the hope. By the time they reached the dugout on Coyote Ridge, the cold mizzle had turned into a full, driving rain. It was a high desert deluge, turning the hardpack to a greasy, treacherous mud. They were soaked to the skin, chilled to the bone, their bodies aching. Cade slid off the gelding and reached up for Tamsin. She was so cold and stiff she almost fell, but he caught her, his hands strong on her waist, and set her on the ground. He shoved open the heavy wooden door to the dugout, and a wave of musty, cold air hit them. "Get inside," he commanded, turning to unsaddle the horse. The dugout was small, barely 12 feet square, and smelled of earth, old coffee, and gun oil. Tamsin stood shivering in the center of the dark room, water dripping from her hair and dress, forming a puddle on the packed dirt floor. Her teeth were chattering, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook her whole frame. It was part cold, part fear, and part a deep, shuddering rage that had no place to go. Cade entered, ducking his head. He carried his saddlebags and a small stack of firewood. He didn't speak. He moved with a swift, economical purpose, striking a match, lighting the single oil lamp on the table, and kneeling at the small, pot-bellied stove. In moments, the kindling caught, and a small, hungry fire began to crackle, its light joining the lamps, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The small room filled with a flickering, orange light. Cade stood and turned to her. He saw her, truly saw her. For the first time in the light, she was a wreck. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder from the night before, and now stained with mud. She was vibrating with cold, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. "It's gone," she said, her voice a low, broken whisper. "Everything, we failed." "We lost the paper," Cade corrected, his voice rough. He tossed a dry blanket onto the single cot. "We didn't fail. We just learned what kind of fight this is." He walked to a small shelf and took down a tin cup and a dark bottle. He poured an inch of whiskey and pushed it into her hand. "Drink it, all of it, before you catch your death." She drank. The whiskey was raw, searing a path of fire down her throat and into her belly. It stopped the shaking, replacing it with a dull, spreading warmth. He turned his back to her, a gesture of privacy. "Get out of that dress. Wrap yourself in the blanket. I'll be back." He grabbed a bucket and slipped back out into the rain to water the horse. When he returned, she was sitting on the cot, wrapped in the thick gray wool blanket, her wet dress in a heap on the floor. The fire was roaring now, and the small room was almost warm. Cade hung his wet duster and gun belt on a peg by the door. He sat on the small, three-legged stool opposite her, the stove between them. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound the hiss and pop of the fire and the relentless drumming of the rain on the dugout sod roof. The adrenaline of the night was draining away, leaving a vast, cold exhaustion. Cade's gaze fell to her shoulder, visible above the line of the blanket. The bandage he had given her, the one from 2 days ago, was soaked through and stained with mud. "That needs cleaning," he said. It was not a suggestion. He got up and went to his saddlebag. He pulled out a small tin and a fresh roll of linen, the twin to the one he'd given her before. He took the kettle from the stove and poured a little hot water into a metal basin, then added cold from the barrel by the door. He set the basin on the floor and knelt in front of her. Tamsin's heart began to beat, a slow, heavy drum, against her ribs. He did not reach for her. He looked her square in the face, his gray eyes clear and steady in the lamplight. "May I?" The question hung in the air. He was asking permission to touch her. Not demanding, not taking, asking. It was a courtesy so profound, so at odds with the violence of the world they lived in, that it almost broke her. She nodded, unable to speak. His hands, she thought, were maps of his life. They were rough, scarred across the knuckles, the calluses thick from reins and rope. But his touch was impossibly gentle. He carefully unwound the soiled, wet linen from her shoulder, his movements slow, deliberate. When the bandage came away, he frowned. The bruise left by Harlan Pike's grip was a dark, ugly stain, and the skin at the center, where her dress had torn, was raw and chafed. "He'll pay for that," Cade said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. It was not a promise to her, but a statement of fact to himself. He dipped a clean cloth in the warm water and, with the same slow care, began to clean the wound. Tamsin drew in a sharp breath as the hot water touched the raw skin. "Sorry," he muttered. "Don't be," she whispered. It's all right." He was close, so close. She was sitting on the cot. He was kneeling on the floor, and their faces were only inches apart. The small stove radiated a dry heat that enveloped them. The dugout was filled with the sound of their breathing, a rhythm that was slowly, unconsciously, starting to match. She watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the silver at his temples, the lines etched at the corners of his eyes. She saw the pulse beating, strong and steady, in the corded muscle of his neck, his breath, smelling faintly of the whiskey he'd shared, misted in the small space between them. She felt the warmth radiating from his chest, and she had an almost overwhelming urge to lean into it, to find a harbor from the cold. He finished cleaning the wound and applied a thin layer of salve from the tin. He took the new linen and began to wrap it, his arm brushing against her collarbone. The touch was electric, a spark on her chilled skin. Her body was telling her to pull away, to wrap the blanket tighter, to keep the barrier between them. But she was so tired of being alone. As he finished the knot, his fingers resting on her shoulder, she moved. It was a small, decisive act. She lifted her hand, the one not clutching the blanket, and placed it over his. His hand was hot against her own. Cade froze. His entire body went still. He did not pull away. He did not move forward. He simply stopped, his gaze lifting from her shoulder to her eyes. He searched her face, looking for fear, for regret, for any sign that this was a mistake. He found only exhaustion and a deep, clear, startling hunger to be seen. "Tamsin," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "If you want me to stop, you say the word, and I'll stop." She looked at him, at this man of edges and shadows, this man who had asked her permission to tend a wound. She thought of Harlan Pike's laugh, of Thatch's white glove, of a world that only took. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No. And then, with a flicker of her own will, she leaned forward, just an inch. It was all the answer he needed. The distance between them, which had been charged with tension, now collapsed. He moved slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. His free hand came up, not to her body, but to her face, his calloused thumb brushing the damp hair from her temple. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a kiss of profound and desperate recognition. It was hesitant, his lips dry, questioning hers. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey and rain and the metallic tang of fear. She met it, her own lips parting, a small, sighing breath escaping her. Then his hand moved from her temple to the back of her neck, his fingers threading into her damp hair, and the kiss deepened. It was as if a banked fire, long dormant, had finally been given air. It became hot and sure and deep, acclaiming. It was a kiss that spoke of every lonely night, every silent battle, every moment of loss. It was the heat of embers buried under ash, finally blazing to life. It was a promise that they were, in this one small, light-filled room, no longer alone. He broke the kiss, but only by inches. They rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling, their eyes closed. The rain hammered on the roof, a wild drumbeat to the sudden, fierce quiet in their hearts. "You make me remember," he breathed, his voice thick, "that I'm alive." She opened her eyes, looking into his. "And you," she whispered, her hand sliding from his to cup his jaw. "You make me feel seen." He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a long, slow exploration, a mapping of a newfound territory. He pulled back, his lips trailing from her mouth to her cheekbone, to her temple, as she turned her head, giving him access. She gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging into the coarse fabric of his shirt, holding on as if the rain-soaked world outside was trying to tear her away. He stood, pulling her up with him, the blanket clutched around her. He didn't let her go. He just held her, his arms wrapped tight around her, her face buried in the hollow of his neck. She could feel his heart, steady and strong, a counterpoint to the wildness of the storm. They stood by the stove, simply holding each other, their bodies learning the shape and feel of the other, their breathing slowing, deepening, finding the same rhythm. It was not a fire, it was a hearth. It was the promise of warmth, of safety. When the fire in the stove began to die down, the wood collapsing into a bed of glowing coals, Cade finally stirred. He led her to the narrow cot. He pulled the second, thicker blanket from his saddle roll and spread it. They lay down, not on top of the covers, but under them, fully wrapped, facing each other in the dim, red light of the dying fire. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He kissed her again, but this kiss was different. It was soft and slow and held no desperation. It was a kiss of simple, profound comfort. They lay like that, tangled in the blankets, their hands clasped. The exhaustion of the night finally settled over them. Tamsin watched the red glow of the stove, listening to the small crackle of the embers. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. Cade saw it. "What?" "The stove," she murmured. "It's so loud. It sounds safe." He smiled back, a rare, unguarded expression that changed his entire face. "It is," he said. "Tonight, it is." He kissed her forehead, a long, lingering press of his lips. "Get some sleep. Tamsin." She closed her eyes, but the questions returned. "The ledger, Cade, the seal, it's all for nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came, low and certain in the dark. "It's not for nothing. We tried it your way, the paper way. It was the right thing to do. Now we know." She opened her eyes. "Know what?" "We know that lawmen can be bought. We know that paper can be stolen. And we know they're not afraid to use violence in the dark." He tightened his grip on her hand. "So, tomorrow we get those papers back, and we do it their way." Outside, a lone coyote let out a long, sharp howl, the sound clear and wild above the dying rain. Tamsin listened to it. She felt the cold of the world, the threat that was still out there, circling in the dark. But inside, she was warm. She moved her free hand, laying it flat on Cade's chest, right over his heart. She felt the steady, solid, living beat of it under her palm. It was a promise. It was an anchor. And for the first of what she knew would be many battles, it was enough. Dawn broke not as a sunrise, but as a wound. The sky over the mountains was a raw, bruised purple, and the rain had given way to a wind that was thin, cold, and smelled of wet iron. They met Nora Bell in the shadow of a rock formation, half a mile from the train tracks, a place where the wind howled and scraped. Nora was not alone. She had Obed Marsh, the blacksmith, and a rancher named Silas Cole, whose water rights Thatch had been threatening for a month. Both men looked grim, and both carried repeating rifles. Nora, her face set, had a bandage on her temple from the night before. She didn't waste time. "Thatch isn't a fool. He knows what we have. Or had. He's not going to sit and wait for us to find it again. He's moving it." "Where?" Tamsin asked, her voice hoarse. "Out of my jurisdiction," Nora said flatly. "The 6:05 Morning Express. It has a single dry-star freight car attached to the back. It's listed as payroll for his canal workers up at Rock Spur. But Rock Spur is across the county line. The second that train crosses the trestle, that car and everything in it is untouchable. It will disappear in a robbery north of the line, and the evidence will be at the bottom of a canyon by noon." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. "I have a warrant, signed by a circuit judge I trust in Tucson, giving me authority to search that car for stolen county property, but," she looked at Cade, "that paper is only good as long as that car is in Mesquite County. If it leaves, it's just a piece of paper." Cade nodded, his mind already working. He looked up at the tracks, which ran along a high embankment, climbing toward the pass. "Dead Man's Loop," he said. "Exactly," Nora said. "It's the highest point before the pass. The train has to slow to a crawl to make the grade, and the curve is so tight it almost stops. It's the only place, but it's still a moving train." "We don't need to stop the whole train," Cade said, his voice low and certain. "We just need to stop the freight car." His plan was simple and insane. "The incline," he explained, "is what helps us. The car is under constant strain, being pulled uphill. I'll get on the car as it climbs. I'll loosen the coupling pin that connects it to the passenger car. Tamsin." He looked at her. "You're lighter. You'll be underneath. There's a lever that pulls the pin free, At the tightest part of the curve, you pull that lever. The car detaches, and the incline will do the rest. It'll lose momentum and roll right back down the grade." "Roll where?" Obed Marsh asked, his voice a nervous rumble. "Right into that," Cade said, pointing to an old, overgrown length of track, a sand spur, built years ago to sidetrack runaway cars and never removed. "It'll roll right into the trap, Nora. You and your men." He nodded at Obed and Silas. "We'll be waiting for it." It was a good plan. It was a clean plan. And it was ruined the moment they saw the train. It came out of the east, a black dragon in the pale light, its headlamp cutting a weak yellow beam. Steam plumed from its stack, hissing into the cold air. And on top of the last car, the target, the dark green Dry-Star freight car, was a man. He was sitting on a crate, a rifle across his knees. Even at a distance, the arrogant, familiar shape of him was unmistakable. Harlan Pike. "He's not alone," Cade said, his voice dropping. He pointed. "On the roof of the passenger car. Another one. A sniper, placed to provide covering fire." Thatch wasn't just moving the evidence. He was guarding it with a show of force. Nora swore, her hand dropping to her pistol. "This changes it. This is a fortress." "No," Cade said. "It's just louder." He turned to Tamsin, his gray eyes hard. "The plan doesn't change. It just gets harder. You still have to get to that lever. It's the only way." "What about you?" she asked, her heart hammering. "Pike is mine," he said. It was not a boast. It was a fact. He turned to Nora. "You and your men, you take the second man, the sniper on the passenger car. You keep his head down. You give me and Tamsin the time we need. Can you do it?" Nora racked a shell into her rifle. "He's in my county. He's mine." The ground began to shake. The chuff of the engine was a physical blow, a pounding in the chest. The train hit the base of the grade and began to slow, the rhythm deepening, the engine straining. "Now," Cade yelled over the noise. They ran from the rocks, scrambling up the gravel embankment. Nora, Obed, and Silas veered left, taking cover in a washout below the tracks, rifles finding their rests. Cade and Tamsin ran alongside the chugging, rattling freight car. The wind from it was a physical blow, full of hot cinders and steam. "The ladder," Cade pointed. "Go get under now." Tamsin didn't hesitate. She grabbed the cold, vibrating iron rungs of the ladder on the side of the car and swung herself up. As she did, Cade grabbed a rope harness he'd prepared and looped it, fast and secure, around her waist and shoulders. "Don't let go, no matter what," he yelled. She swung herself off the ladder and under the car, into the roaring, shaking darkness of the undercarriage. It was hell. The noise was a solid thing, a deafening wall of sound. The ground was a blur of gravel just a few feet below her. Hot steam and filthy water blasted her face. She clung to the iron struts, her hands cramping instantly, and began to pull herself, hand over hand, toward the back of the car, toward the coupling. Cade watched her disappear. He took a breath, grabbed the same ladder, and went up, swinging his body over the edge and onto the flat roof. The wind hit him like a fist. He was moving at 20 miles an hour, the car swaying and jolting beneath him. Harlan Pike was at the far end, by the brake wheel. He had seen Cade coming. He was on his feet, his rifle up, a look of pure, joyous hatred on his face. "Whitlock," he roared over the wind. "I knew you'd come. I've been waiting for this. I owed you this." Pike fired. The shot was high, the bullet screaming off into the purple sky. Cade didn't go for his pistol. Not yet. He ran, low and fast, diving behind a stack of tarpaulins as Pike's second shot tore through the canvas where he'd been. Crack! A different sound, a rifle shot from the gully. Nora, the second sniper, on the car behind them, yelled in surprise as the shot sparked off the metal roof near his feet. He turned, firing back down into the rocks. Crack, crack. Obed and Silas answered. The battle was joined. Underneath the car, Tamsin reached the coupling. She could see the mechanism, a heavy, greased pin held in place by a horizontal lever. She was anchored by Cade's rope, her feet braced against a crossbeam. She grabbed the iron handle of the lever. It was cold, slick with grease. She pulled. It didn't budge. It was jammed tight, the full weight of the freight car pulling against it on the steep grade. On the roof, Cade moved. He burst from behind the tarps, firing his Remington. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming for the rifle. His first shot was a clean, ringing ping, hitting the barrel of Pike's rifle and knocking it from his grasp. Pike roared in rage and lunged, pulling a long skinning knife from his belt. He closed the distance in 2 strides, a brutal, close-quarters fight. Tamsin pulled again, her feet slipping, her muscles screaming. The train was lurching, rounding the tightest part of Dead Man's Loop. It was now. She had seconds. Pike and Cade crashed against the side of the roof. Grappling, Cade blocked the knife thrust, the blade slicing his forearm. He brought his knee up, hard, into Pike's gut. But Pike was a bull. He grabbed Cade by the duster, trying to heave him over the side. The second sniper, ignored for a moment, saw his chance. He aimed at Cade. Crack! Cade yelled. A sharp, choked-off sound. The bullet took him high in the left shoulder. The impact was a hammer blow, spinning him around. His grip on Pike broke. He stumbled, his boot slipping on the wet metal. He was falling, sprawling toward the edge of the roof. Below, Tamsin saw the pin, the lever, the tracks. She thought of Juniper Bend. She thought of Pike's laugh. She thought of Cade's hand on her face in the dark. Now, she screamed, a word no one could hear. She put both feet on the strut, braced her back, and threw her entire body weight, all 120 pounds of it, into the lever. There was a sound like a gunshot, a screech of tortured metal. The lever moved. The pin disengaged. The freight car slammed, a violent, bone-jarring lurch, as it was suddenly, terrifyingly, set free. The lurch threw Tamsin from her hold. Her feet slipped. Her hands were torn from the lever. She was falling. The rope harness snapped taut, catching her, but it swung her out from under the car, into the open air. She was dangling, spinning, held only by the rope tied to the roof, the gravel tracks rushing by just feet below her. Cade, wounded, blood pouring from his shoulder, saw her. He was on his hands and knees, sliding, but he saw the rope go taut over the edge. He saw her dangling. He lunged. He ignored the pain, ignored Pike, who was scrambling for his lost rifle. Cade slid to the edge, grabbed the rope with his one good hand, and hauled. Tamsin swung up, crashing into the side of the car. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was a band of steel. Their eyes locked. It was not a half second. It was an eternity. Terror, trust, will. Climb, he roared. He pulled, his biceps straining, the muscles in his good arm cording like rope. He pulled her up, over the edge. She scrambled onto the roof, collapsing in a heap as he fell back, his face white with pain. The freight car was free. It was slowing. The momentum of the climb lost. Harlan Pike, on his feet, looked back at the engine and passenger car, which was already pulling away. Disappearing around the bend, he looked at Cade, wounded, at Tamsin, victorious. He was stranded. The car stopped. Then, with a soft groan, it began to roll. Backward. Pike looked wildly at the brake wheel, but it was too late. The car was rolling, faster and faster. Back down the grade, it hit the switch for the sand spur with a heavy clang-clang and veered off the main line, rolling another 20 yards into the deep sand and coming to a gentle, final stop. It was over. Pike and the second sniper were gone, carried away on the train, defeated. Nora, Obed, and Silas ran up to the car, their rifles raised. "It's done!" Tamsin yelled from the roof. Obed Marsh didn't wait. He jammed his crowbar into the heavy, padlocked door of the freight car and put his massive shoulders into it. The lock snapped. The door rolled open. Nora Bell stepped inside, her pistol drawn. The car was empty, except for one, medium-sized, black-painted safe, bolted to the floor. "The payroll," Nora said, her voice grim. She took the crowbar from Obed. "Stand back." She jammed the bar into the seam of the safe door and, with a grunt, broke the hinges. The door fell open. There was no payroll. There were no stacks of coins. It was full of paper. Tamsin, with Cade leaning heavily on her, his arm dripping blood, climbed down and peered inside. Nora reached in and pulled out the consignment's ledger. She pulled out the heavy, misspelled brass seal. And then, from the bottom, she pulled out a third, smaller book. It was a simple black ledger, the kind a man might keep his private accounts in. Nora opened it. "My God," she whispered. It was Thatch's black book. It was all there. A meticulous, arrogant record of his conquest. August 4th at Colt, $200. Gambling debt, August 10th. Sheriff P. Lyle, consulting fee, $100. August 14th. Backdated tax seizure, J.B. It was a list of every bribe, every false date, every coerced signature. And tucked into the front cover, as if for a souvenir, was a single, folded document. Tamsin took it, her hands trembling. She unfolded it. It was the original deed to Juniper Bend, her father's signature. And in the margins, in Thatch's own impatient hand, were notes. Practice for the forgery. Mesquite, mesquite. He had practiced the error, over and over, until he got it right. They had it, not just the evidence of the crime, but the confession. The war for paper, Tamsin thought, was finally, truly, over. The hoofprints were clear in the damp sand left by the night's rain. They led away from the settled lands, away from the border, climbing into the high, broken country. Harlan Pike was riding a tired horse, and he was riding it hard. He was not running toward safety. He was running toward an end. Cade, Tamsin, and Nora, now flanked by Obed Marsh and Silas Cole, tracked him for 2 hours. Cade read the signs from his saddle, his face a pale, grim mask, his wounded shoulder held stiff. "He's running out of country," Cade said, his voice low. The tracks veered sharply left into a narrow cleft in the red rock. "He's taken the bait. Box Canyon." Nora Bell pulled her horse up. "A dead end." "The worst kind," Cade said. "Sheer walls, one way in. It's where the old-timers used to corral wild horses. Or," he added, his voice flat, "settle blood debts." The wind was already whistling from the canyon's mouth, a thin, sharp sound like a knife being drawn. They dismounted at the entrance, the air suddenly cold. Nora looked at Cade's sling. "You're in no shape for this." "He's my business," Cade said. "He was my business for 6 years before he was yours. We do this my way." He looked at Tamsin. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Cade pointed to a narrow game trail, a ledge that switchbacked up the canyon's northern wall. "I'll take the high rim. It'll be slow with this arm, but it'll give me a clear view. He's trapped, and he knows it. He'll be waiting in the rocks." He turned to Tamsin. "You and Nora, you come in low and slow. Keep him looking back, keep him nervous. I want him flushed, but I don't want him running." "No," Tamsin said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Cade and Nora both looked at her. "Nora, you and your men stay here. At the mouth. You're the law. You're the trap. He tries to get past you. You stop him." She turned to Cade. This is for us. He put his hands on me. He left your brother to die. This is not for the law. This is for the debt. I'm going in." Cade looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the woman from the dugout, the woman from the train. He nodded once. "All right, I'll take the rim. You take the floor. Give me 10 minutes to get above him, then you go." Tamsin watched him begin the slow, agonizing climb. His good hand finding holds in the rock, his boots slipping on the loose scree. Nora, Obed, and Silas took up positions behind the boulders at the canyon's entrance. A solid wall of rifles. Tamsin counted to 500, her breath held tight in her chest. Then she unholstered the pistol Nora had insisted she carry, checked the load, and walked forward, leading her horse into the shadowed, wind-swept corridor. The canyon floor was deep red dust and shattered rock. The walls rose 300 feet, sheer and smooth. The wind was a living thing in here, whining, pushing at her back. She saw him, half a mile in, where the canyon twisted. His horse was hip-shot, breathing hard. Harlan Pike was using the animal as a barricade, his rifle resting on the saddle. He was waiting. Tamsin did not stop. She kept walking, her pace steady. She was not aiming her pistol. She was an inevitability. "That's far enough," Pike's voice echoed, rough and desperate. "That's far enough, you bitch!" Tamsin kept walking. She stopped 100 yards from him. A safe distance. "It's over. Harlan, Thatch is in chains. Nora Bell is behind me. Walk out." Pike let out a raw, broken laugh. Walk out to what a rope you think you've won. You think that old fool judge and that woman with a badge? You think they matter?" He spat into the dust. "You think winning back that scrap of dusty land means you beat me?" Tamsin stood very still. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was sharper than the wind. "It was never just the land. Harlan, I won my name back first." The words, the simple, undeniable truth of them, seemed to break his last tether. This was not the woman he had thrown off her porch. This was not the frightened victim he had planned to humiliate at the ball. This was something else, something he couldn't break. His rage was a physical explosion. He snapped the rifle up, not to his shoulder, but firing from the hip, a wild, angry shot. Tamsin didn't flinch, but she felt the hot wind of the bullet. It tore through the crown of her hat, ripping it from her head and sending it tumbling into the dust. A second shot answered the first, but this one was not wild. It was high, precise, and came from above. "Crack!" Harlan yelled. A sound of pain and surprise. His rifle flew from his hands, clattering onto the rocks. The stock shattered. He clutched his right hand, his fingers bloody. Cade was on the rim, 100 feet up, his body braced against the rock wall. He was sighting down the barrel of his Remington, his bad arm hanging useless, his good arm resting on his knee, steady as stone. Pike looked at his ruined hand. He looked at Tamsin, who now had her pistol raised. He looked up at Cade, a hawk on the cliff. He was trapped between them. He did the only thing a cornered animal can do. He charged. But he didn't charge Tamsin. He looked up at Cade, the man he had betrayed, and he began to scramble up the scree slope, roaring, his knife in his good hand. "Cade!" Tamsin screamed. Cade didn't have time to reload. He stood, but the slope was treacherous. Harlan, fueled by pure, suicidal rage, covered the distance, grabbing Cade's legs. Cade fell, his wounded shoulder hitting the rock. He cried out, the pain blinding him. They tumbled down the slope, a messy avalanche of rock and red dust, landing hard on the canyon floor. It was not a fair fight. It was a slaughter. Cade was half-stunned, his left arm completely useless. Harlan was a bull, a mass of muscle and fury. He was on top of Cade, his knife lost in the fall, but he didn't need it. His strong, bloody hands found Cade's throat. Cade kicked, his boots finding no purchase in the soft dust. He clawed at Harlan's wrists with his one good hand, but the grip was iron. He couldn't get leverage. He was choking, his face turning a dark, terrible purple. his eyes wide, fixed on Tamsin. Tamsin had the pistol. She was 10 feet away. She could shoot. She could end it. She could kill the man who had bruised her, humiliated her town, and left her new life in ruins. It would be simple. It would be justice. But as she raised the pistol, her hands shaking, she saw Cade's eyes. This was not justice. This was an execution, and it was not who she was. She had fought for her name, and her name was not Killer. She dropped the pistol into the dust. Her lariat was still coiled on her saddle. She ripped it free. She didn't try to make a loop. She grabbed the heavy, rawhide rope and ran. Harlan's full attention was on the man beneath him, on the life he was extinguishing. Tamsin didn't swing. She threw the entire heavy coil of rope, with all her strength, not at his head, but at his legs. The stiff, hard rope uncoiled, tangling around his boots and knees. He stumbled, his balance broken. His grip on Cade's throat loosened as he tried to kick his feet free. It was the only opening. Tamsin slammed into him, shoulder first, shoving him sideways. He fell, rolling off Cade, roaring in fury as he tried to untangle himself from the rope. Cade rolled away, gasping, coughing, sucking in the dusty air, alive. Harlan was on his knees, trying to get up, but Tamsin was on him. She was on his back, not with fists, but with purpose. She grabbed his one good hand, pulled it behind his back, and with the quick, brutal efficiency of a rancher handling a calf, she wrapped the end of her lariat around his wrists. She pulled the slack, dug her knee into his spine, and tied a knot so tight it bit into his skin. He was subdued. He was breathing. He was beaten. She stood back, her entire body trembling with adrenaline, the rope in her hand. Harlan lay on his stomach, spitting blood and dust. He turned his head, and a low, gurgling laugh came from his throat. You think this is the end, he choked. You're a fool. Thatch will walk. He's got lawyers in Tucson. He's got money. He'll be free in a month, and I'll be with him. Tamsin looked down at the man who had been her monster. He was just a man, bleeding in the dirt. She let out a long, slow breath. Maybe he will, she said, her voice shaking but clear. But you won't. You, Harlan, will be in a cell, and you will sit there, and you will listen to every single word of your sentence as it is read. The sound of horses echoed in the canyon. Nora Bell rode in, followed by Obed and Silas, their rifles ready. They stopped, taking in the seen Pike, tied on the ground, Tamsin, standing over him with a rope, and Cade, on his hands and knees, alive. Nora dismounted, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She pulled Harlan to his feet, cut Tamsin's rope, and replaced it with her own. The metallic click-snick of the handcuffs was sharp and final, the loudest sound in the canyon. It was the sound of a chapter ending, the sound of a debt paid. Later, they stood on the canyon rim. Nora and her men were leading Pike, now slumped in his saddle, back toward the town. The sun was beginning to set, and the high desert was awash in colors of apricot and sage. Tamsin's hands would not stop shaking. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a deep, profound exhaustion. Cade came to stand beside her. He was alive. His shoulder was a mess, but he was alive. He looked down at her hands, which she was trying to hide in the folds of her skirt. With his one good hand, he reached out and took her shaking one, holding it steady. His hand was warm and solid. You chose to live, Tamsin, he said quietly, his voice rough. Not just to win. She looked up at him, her hair wild, her face smeared with dust and sweat, her hat still lying on the canyon floor 100 feet below. She was a ruin, and she was magnificent. A slow smile, one born of pure, aching exhaustion and a fierce, unfamiliar pride, touched her lips. The wind swept up from the canyon, cold and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush. They stood for a moment, letting it wash over them, Then, together, they turned their backs on the dark cleft in the rock and began the walk to their horses. The valley opened up before them, wide and full of promise, waiting. The appeal in Tucson was a formality. When presented with Gideon Thatch's Black Book, the federal judge took less than 10 minutes to void every fraudulent deed, every coerced compact, and every false claim. The Thatch Canal project was dead, its assets seized, its half-dug channel already beginning to fill with tumbleweeds. Thatch himself, facing a litany of federal charges, was gone, his future to be decided in a high-security prison far from the territory he had tried to conquer. But the paper victory was only the beginning. The land remained. Juniper Bend was a wreck. Thatch's men, in their brief, angry possession, had run roughshod over it. Fences were down, the trough by the barn was split, and the small alfalfa field her father had so carefully irrigated was a patch of dry, cracked earth. Tamsin O'Rourke stood on her own porch, the real deed in her hand, and surveyed the damage. She was alone, just as she had been at the start. Then she heard it, the thud of a heavy mallet, and the scrape of a wagon. Obed Marsh was at the fence line, his sleeves rolled up, tamping a new post into the ground. Behind him, Silas Cole was unloading wire from his wagon. By the well, Maeve Lark was sorting through a box of Tamsin's belongings that she had apparently hidden at the Copper Finch for safekeeping. "You're tracking mud on the porch, Maeve," Tamsin said, her voice thick. "And you're standing there like a post," Maeve retorted, not looking up. "The water won't carry itself, girl, and that alfalfa won't turn green just by you staring at it." Cade was there, too. His left arm, now free of the sling, was still stiff, but he was strong enough to work the pulley on the well. He lowered a bucket, and the splash when it hit the water, deep and clear and cool, was the sweetest sound Tamsin had ever heard. The town worked for a week. They rebuilt the fences, they mended the trough, they cleared the choked irrigation ditch, and when Tamsin and Cade finally opened the sluice gate, the water, her water, their water, rushed into the dry field. They stood side by side, covered in mud and sweat, and watched the thirsty ground drink. The granary hall, too, was reclaimed. The scene of the chaos was scrubbed clean. The broken chandelier was replaced by two simpler, smaller ones. The bullet holes in the rafters were left as a reminder. Maeve Lark declared they would have a celebration. Not a ball, she insisted, but a proper Saturday night dance. A community dance, she called it. And this time, instead of the sickly, oppressive yellow of Thatch's ambition, Maeve hung lanterns she had painstakingly dyed herself. A deep, calm, hopeful blue. Tamsin would not wear the calico. That dress, the one she had worn to the courthouse, was folded and put away. She spent 2 days at Maeve's sewing machine, and on the night of the dance, she wore a simple dress of homespun linen, the color of oats. It had no frills, no lace, but it was clean, and it was hers. Her hair was brushed until it shone, and tucked behind one ear was a small spray of wild purple sage, the scent of her own land. Cade wore his trail clothes, clean and pressed. He had no tailcoat, no silk vest, but as Tamsin came down the stairs from her old attic room at Maeve's, she saw him waiting by the door. He was turning something over in his hands. It was the leather armband she had found in his dugout, the one with the broken stitching. She had taken it, one quiet evening, and mended it with a strong flax thread. The stitching was neat, and it was strong. He slid it onto his arm, a silent, shared acknowledgement. The hall was full. The music was bright, the fiddles playing a sweet, clear waltz. The air smelled of waxed wood, fresh bread, and coffee. Tamsin stood by the punch bowl, watching. She saw Obed Marsh, who never danced, actually twirling his wife. She saw Silas Cole laughing with the same neighbors he had been ready to fight a month before. She saw children, who had been hidden away during the thatch business, skidding and sliding on the floor. their laughter echoing up to the rafters. No one was afraid. No one was posturing. No one was measuring their words. It was a town breathing free. Cade crossed the room. He moved with the same quiet grace, but the coiled, dangerous energy was gone, replaced by a simple, solid presence. He stopped in front of her. The dancers swirled around them, a kaleidoscope of blue light. He did not bow. He did not make a speech. He simply held out his good hand, palm up, the hand that had held hers in the dark, the hand that had hauled her, saving her, from the side of the train. "A dance, Tamsin," he said, his voice low. "Just for her. If you want." The world seemed to stop for a second. Tamsin looked at his offered hand. She saw the floor, the same waxed floor, and for a fraction of a second, she was back in that other night. The yellow lights burning, the crowd silent, and the terrifying sight of Gideon Thatch's white-gloved hand, demanding her surrender. She remembered the feeling of being trapped, the humiliation, the cold vow that she would rather die. Then she looked up. She saw Cade's face. His gray eyes were steady, and in them, she saw no demand, only an invitation. She saw the man who had asked her permission to clean a wound, the man who had shielded her with his own body, the man who had trusted her to stand by him in a canyon. She placed her hand in his. "I want," she whispered. He led her onto the floor. Their first steps were hesitant. She was a rancher's daughter, not a dancer. He was a man of the trail, used to the rhythm of a horse, not a waltz. But then they found it. His right hand rested on her waist, his touch light, respectful. Her left hand rested on his good shoulder, their other hands clasped. It was not a grip of possession, but a simple, warm connection. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes, asking for permission to guide, and she answered with a small nod, giving it. They began to move, slowly, then more surely, their steps finding the rhythm of the music, and then the rhythm of each other. They moved as one. He did not pull her. He guided her. She did not resist. She moved with him. The crowded room seemed to fade away, the blue lanterns blurring, until there was only the music and the solid, safe presence of the man in front of her. When the music finally slowed, the last note of the fiddle hanging in the air, they did not spring apart. They simply stopped, standing in the center of the quiet floor. He did not let her go. He simply drew her a half-step closer. He leaned down, and just as he had in the dugout, in the dark, with the rain hammering on the roof, he touched his forehead to hers. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of his soap, leather, and the clean, cold air of the night. "Cade," she whispered, her voice so low he could barely hear it. "I'm here." "You have a home," she said, her voice shaking just a little. "At Juniper Bend, if you want it." He was still for a moment. She felt his breath against her skin. He smiled, a slow, real smile that she felt more than saw. "Home isn't a place, Tamsin," he whispered back, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him. "It's where you are." He kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the rainy night, a kiss born of survival and fear. It was not the brief, comfortless kiss of the canyon. This was a kiss of promise. It was slow, and it was gentle, and it was warm. It was a kiss that tasted of the sweet punch on her lips and the coffee on his. It was a kiss that smelled, not of gunpowder and dust, but of fresh-cut hay, new grass, and the clean, steady burn of an oil lamp. It was a kiss that spoke of a future, of shared harvests, and of a fight that was, at last, truly over. Outside, on the main road, a new sign hung at the turnoff to her property. It had been painted by Obed Marsh, in crisp black letters. It did not just say, "Juniper Bend." It said, "Juniper Bend, common water, common ground, common honor." The revenge had been closed, not by a bullet, but by justice. And the love, not a thing of fate, but a thing of choice, was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please share your thoughts and where you are in the world in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you can press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.